Hello, this is Black Kids in Outer Space. Today, our guest is Majora Carter. Carter is a leading urban revitalization strategy consultant, real estate developer, and Peabody Award winning broadcaster. She is responsible for the creation and implementation of numerous green infrastructure policies and job training and placement systems at Sustainable South Bronx. Carter deployed MIT's first ever Mobile Fab-Lab digital fabrication laboratory to the South Bronx, where it served as an early iteration of the maker space found elsewhere today. The project drew residents and visitors together for guided and creative collaborations. After establishing Sustainable South Bronx and Green for All and many other organizations to carry on that work, she opened a private consulting firm to help spread the message and success of social enterprise, economic development in low-status communities, and which was named the best for the world by B-Corp 2014. Now, thank you so much for coming, Majora. I think one thing I want to ask you is I want to start with the words when you won your Peabody Award in 2010. You don't know how to move out of your neighborhood to live in a better one.
That quote came from a woman named Marta Rodriguez, who was the community outreach coordinator when I ran Sustainable South Bronx. And at a staff meeting, it literally he described the work that we did in his organization in that way. And it's something that I literally say almost every day, basically, because it was the sort of the ethos of our work. Oh, and did you know that it's actually at the actually installed as part of the permanent collection at the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
I did not know that, but that is just, I think that is so important. One thing I also want to say is that you're an urban revitalization strategist. And that's, since I think it's great, a lot of people who watch our show are not people who are green or part of the urban planning world. And the thing is that redevelopment in the last 50 to 70 years have been kind of destructive in some communities. How is your work different?
We use real estate development as the potentially transformational tool that it could be, which runs very counter to the way that I think real estate's been used in low status communities for decades now, where there's only two kinds, where you either where there's gentrification, where there's this phenomenon, precipitated by the real estate industry, where there's speculators and developers come into a low status community and quickly buy off and buy out the people that do own property. And, then the poor people that are left there are kind of pushed out as the neighborhood gets better. And then that's gentrification. But the other kind of development that often happens in those communities is something we've called poverty level economic maintenance. And that is involved when basically there's still money being made in those communities, but they're not the kind of things that you necessarily think of as money makers in any regard. So it's, the kind of, instead of having things like banks and credit unions, you'll have things such as payday loan places or check cashing stores or pawn shops. Instead of great places to have, where there's a diversity of food options, healthy and otherwise, instead you'll have very limited opportunities for healthy food or even other dining options. Or, there's also less opportunity where you definitely think the schools are worse. Let's see what else. Lots and lots of very highly subsidized affordable housing. And that's pretty much it. And I often say that it's not that I have any issue with poor people. I mean, I was born in very, very, very limited means and still kind of there, actually. But what I do know, when you put all those things together, you concentrate poverty and you concentrate all of the things associated with it that allegedly the nonprofit industrial complex is really working hard to address. Everything from low educational attainment to high rates of incarceration, people who are criminally justice involved in these communities, definitely higher rates of poverty, bad health outcomes. All of these things are concentrated when poverty level economic maintenance happens in low status communities. So our approach to real estate development is all about retaining the talent that was born and raised in those communities, so that they're not taught, so that they're not believing the idea that you have to measure success by how far you get away from those communities, but you're actually thinking about how that this community sustains me in many different ways. From these are the kind of communities that people want to stay in, that, you know, instead of fleeing to another neighborhood where they think actually meets the kind of lifestyle that they want, our approach to real estate development creates those kind of that lifestyle infrastructure within these communities, thus making people who would literally move out of these neighborhoods to go find a better one to live in see their own community as a place in which they can build a life and invest in, but not just economically.
Well, I think one thing I want to ask you is that why did you decide to stay in your community? I know you were from Hunts Point, Bronx,
Mhm.
and you went back there and you stayed there. Why did you decide to do that? Because you could have
Uh,
done this work outside the community. You could have been one of the people who are like, oh, I want to help my community, but not live there still.
I wasn't trying to help my community. I was trying to get out of it, which I did. And I used education to do so. I only came back here because I needed a cheap place to stay when I went to graduate school. I went to New York
Mm-hmm.
University. And it was my old room at my parents' house. Um, I only stayed when I came face to face with the kind of discrimination that low status communities, not just mine, but around the country, actually deal with. When we realized that the city and state were planning on building a huge waste facility here, despite the fact that we already handled an enormous amount of the city's waste already, they were willing to concentrate even more here. And because I had this great education and some distance from the community, it was very plain for me to see that this is happening because we happen to be a low status community, very low income, predominantly Latino and Black. And because of that, they were adding insult to injury. And something moved in me. It really did. And that's when I was like, I'd like to be a part of some of the change that I know we as a community need to experience for our own benefit, and not be the repository for all the negative things that wealthier and usually whiter communities can afford to avoid.
Well, I read something really interesting. Well, not read something. I watched one of your interviews, and it said that one of the things you did was you bought 50 shares of a company that was polluting your community. What did that achieve, and what are the limitations of those kinds of tactics?
Oh, it was one of the most actually cost effective and oh gosh, how do I say this? Because there was this sewage sludge pelletizing plant that just made, you know, a total mess out of the community. I mean, literally, it would smell like rotten eggs because of the kind of emissions that it would produce. And you say they were just fine with it. They wanted to expand their capacity, and it was, you know, they'd been doing this to the community for a long time. And so we partnered with actually, a faith-based group that, you know, we had a funny name for them because they were all nuns, but they wore cardigans and they were just the cutest things you've ever seen in your life. But they would show up and just with these little pearls on and just be like, this is how we're going to roll, gentlemen. And they had this really great approach, which is like they just bought just enough shares to make it so you can actually put in a resolution. That's all you need to do. That's it. And we put in this resolution, not thinking that anybody was going to pay that much attention, but they did, in fact. And I just will never forget when, you know, even we couldn't even afford to go to the meeting. I think the shareholder meeting was somewhere in Texas. So we just sort of like put it out as a resolution. And then enough of the voting members saw this thing, and it was just about like, maybe as a company, we should check to see what's coming out of the stacks and how it's affecting the local community. And enough people that were voters were just so concerned that they kind of sent the CFO and a whole bunch of other folks to come out and meet with us. And that was the point where they just, on their own, just started winding down operations, essentially. It took a number of years, but that was the beginning. That was the absolute beginning. After gosh, more than a decade of people protesting and stuff in the streets and holding rallies and just saying you're bad and you smell funny. And this was just like, nah, it was the money. It was their shareholders who were just like, this doesn't look good, guys. And
well, that I think that was probably one of the most amazing stories. We have like one question from the audience. It's like so huge. It said Jane Jacobs talked about poor neighborhoods that were poor but stable. But because they were stable, people could build those social bonds and make low income bearable. And they could build up social capital, real capital, and even poverty. It may not be concentration of poverty, but unstable poverty. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know it's kind of a big question.
Yeah, I think many of the neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs talked about, they were not exclusively poor communities with the lowest income bands. There was a bit more economic diversity where there was the working poor, there was like lower middle income poor, there was a depth of diversity. And I think that we need to be clear about that, and not because the type of poverty that I'm talking about is the kind where there's way more homeless shelters than there are even renters, where there's people at the lowest level of the income bands that you will find in a city. And those are the places, those aren't the places Jane Jacobs is talking about. It's just so, because when you are that poor, and not to say that there ain't no power like the power of the people, but what I do know is that it is very easy to push around poor people because they have other things to worry about. And that's why the economic diversity within a community, like just think about the fact, around during the civil rights legislation or civil rights era, or what led to civil rights legislation, it actually was a very diverse group of people. And middle income Blacks actually were a big part of that, huge part of that. And, they were the ones, who owned the businesses, who could actually put up, Dr. King and the rest of those folks when they were traveling through the South in particular, because they had that capacity to do so. So I think I don't think there's any nobility or romance in poverty when you're in it. And I think on some level, there's that feeling where we tend to think that poverty is a bit of a cultural attribute, as if it's something to preserve, and it is not, especially when you're. But anyway, I want to just say one more thing. Sorry about that, because I totally.
That's okay.
But going back to the civil rights era, and I think we have to acknowledge one of the unintended consequences of integration was that prior to all the civil rights legislation, we actually had this Black neighborhoods were actually much more economically diverse. And so it really wasn't uncommon for a Black doctor to be a Black janitor and something like that. And so that you can actually see a future that was outside of poverty, just because that there were other opportunities available for you to see. And it's hard, I think, you won't know what you can't see in many cases.
That's so great. I mean, I grew up in a Black neighborhood that was more of a middle class Black neighborhood. So I saw all this diversity within like all the possibilities that you could see. But I mean, I really do like and respect that kind of like, hey, there's no nobility in poverty. And to kind of go to that, I want to know that, instead of going the way of becoming a politician or the public sector, you went the private sector. Is that kind of the reason why you want to kind of show the economic strength of what we can have in our communities?
Yes, absolutely. I think great projects can drive good policy, but I'm not so, I just don't have that much faith in the political system at this point to see it through that. Although I did at one point actually wanted to run for city council and the whole shebang, and who knows what might happen. But right now, no. I just really feel that there aren't enough of the kind of projects, in particular in real estate development, that are happening in communities like the South Bronx. And I feel like unless there's actually models where we're showing these type of developments for economic diversity that actually retains the talent that's in our communities, so that that becomes the strengthening factor of those communities and creates a level of social cohesion that we have not had since the civil rights movement. You know, because when housing legislation changed and, you know, Blacks of a certain class could move where they wanted, allegedly, I know that was very problematic as well. When they could move, they did. And the state of Black America has actually, I would argue, gotten a bit worse, and especially in America's low status communities. I mean, I think there's only been a couple of years since the passage of most of that civil rights legislation where things like Black male unemployment has not gone up. You know, where we've seen, you know, infant mortality rates, you know, in some parts of the Black community actually worse than it is in many developing countries. What is that about? I would argue that some of it has to do with the local economic development, and that when people are more in a financial position to support the quality of their lives, all sorts of things on the positive spectrum are eligible or open for them. But when they're not, then you do have a life of traumatic stress that affects everything from your health to your mental and emotional state and everything else associated with it.
I mean, that's true. You know, and another thing is, because I have a wide variety of people listening, I thought something was really interesting is that you're a born again Christian. And what role has, you know, I know this is kind of a strange question, but what role has Jesus or this Christianity or God played in this kind of your path in regards to urban planning and green? And I mean, even though it's like it should go together. I mean, I went to the Catholic school for a long time, but, you know, give us some thoughts about that.
It's so sad to me that, you know, I think it's funny because I've always thought Jesus was really cool. Like, he was actually nicer to women than anybody ever gave him credit for, even like the little bit of reading that I did before. But ultimately, right now, and since it is a fairly new thing for me too, it does make sense that his job was literally to save the world, even if they didn't feel like they needed anything. And he gave his life so willingly to do that. And, you know, thank God nobody's asking me to like hang myself up on a cross or anything, because that is awful. But I do feel that my work is absolutely connected to my spirituality and how I feel about it. And it just makes it even more important and more urgent, because if his first commandment is to love him, and the next one is to love my neighbor, then again, whether or not they accept him, like, my job is to try to make our lives, that when we're here, a better place to be.
No, that's to me, that's a wonderful thing. And I want to know, just because a lot of us who are in urban planning, who are in green, who are in the environment, it's hard for us to kind of make that leap from kind of the, you know, the nonprofit sector to the private sector. How did you make that leap, and why did you decide to do that leap? You know, give us some advice.
I was always a horrible nonprofit person. I mean, I was one of those executive directors who was always like, oh God, like, this is awful. Like, it's just, it was a thankless job where I felt that people expected people to be sick and hurt and angry. I don't think it's a great career path for anybody. And I was grateful to be able to find the courage enough to be like, deuces, because it really wasn't pleasant. I think I still find it one of the most I mean, bottom line is, I think it was much more focused on optics rather than outcomes in a lot of ways. And there was more rhetoric than results. And that was really supported. And, you know, and I had this really kind of weird feeling this was actually in the numbers, where even though my work was very respected and talked about all over the place, the more known my work got, the more the more my funding went down, and it became really nearly impossible to do my work and actually to have the kind of quality of life that I needed. I was hospitalized twice, and I felt it coming on a third time. It's time to say goodbye. And
No, I think that, we're about to wrap it up now, and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience. Is there anything you want to leave Black Kids in Outer Space with?
you can go wherever you want, my peoples. It's just, and despite the fact that wherever people think you don't belong, that's where you should be.
All right. Thank you so much, Majora, for coming on our show. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work you've done, and we'll be looking forward to seeing all the great things you're going to bring to not just the South Bronx, but to all of and all of inner city America. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.
Black kids in outer space. Black kids in outer space. Black kids in outer space. Urban planning, walking, bicycling, and more in our space.